too often when we talk about juvenile justice, we talk around and about the kids who are actually in the center of the system, and we rarely hear from them about how the system is affecting them and what they think needs to be done to change that. So this next panel is aimed at remedying that, and we're calling it Voices for Change for obvious reasons. And to take us through it, we're really honored to have Hernán Carvente Martinez, who is the National Youth Partnership Strategist at Youth First Initiative. I'll let Hernán introduce the two speakers. And once again, we will go till about 4 o'clock or so. This is our last panel of the afternoon, and we'll try to leave as much room as possible for questions. And again, if you have more questions or more questions occur to you for Nate, as well as the other panelists in this session that we aren't able to answer, please write them down, send them to me, or put them in the chat line or the Q&A line, and we'll certainly get them answered. So Hernán, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and the gavel is yours.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. And thank you everyone for tuning in. I know I can't see all your beautiful faces, but I'm really happy to be here and being able to facilitate this conversation with two amazing young people that I really admire and respect so much because I've been able to work with them for the past 3 years. I'm actually going to be introducing both of them. And one of the things that I want to prefix this conversation by is just saying that, you know, I think about a year ago, was it Stephen, or was it 2 years ago? I don't remember. I actively did a similar conversation with a friend of mine, Jim St. Germain, and I was one of the young people on the panel.
Yes.
And so one of the
great panel. I remember that.
Yeah, one of the beautiful things about this is being able to now facilitate a conversation with other young people and really trying to model for you all the importance of having younger generations and younger people and advocates and organizers really leading these conversations, and it not being just the same person every time sharing the same story or the same thought or perspective. So I just really want to lead off with that piece. And so I'm actively going to be holding this conversation with my friend Tyler Williams, who is a community organizer for Progeny out in Kansas. And I'll also be joined by Iliana Pujols, who is the Director of Community Connections at the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. And so I'm going to give each of them an opportunity to just briefly share a little bit about themselves, what brought them to this work, and why this conversation with reporters from around the country is important to them. So Tyler, I'm gonna give it to you first.
Yeah, so my name is Tyler Williams. I'm a youth leader with Progeny and a full-time staff with the Seed House. A little bit about me: I was born and raised in Cashin, Oklahoma, and I went into the juvenile justice system at the age of 13. I got out at the age of 19 and was placed on probation. I was later removed from probation for doing too good and became homeless for several months. During that time, we were really starting out Progeny, getting things going, and with the help of the Seed House and Youth First and the investment that they gave us in training, I get to do this work now. It's been a long road, you know, being one of the original members of Progeny. It's been great. It's a lot of work. We focus on a lot of juvenile justice related issues in Kansas, and we are currently housed in Wichita.
Thank you, Tyler. And next, I'm going to let Iliana introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Iliana Pujols. I'm Director of Community Connections at the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. Just a little bit about me: born and raised New Haven County, Connecticut. Similar to Tyler, I have my own personal experience with the juvenile justice system. Started really early, probably about 11 and a half, 12 years old. The Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance is a public policy and advocacy organization that I've been working with since about 2017, going on 3 years now. We've been functioning as a youth adult partnership model since then. I've had the pleasure of starting as their founding team of justice advisors and now supervising them. So I guess I'll dive more into that as we go deeper into the conversation. But yeah, just very grateful to be here and in the space, able to provide insight and just really tap into this conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Iliana. So part of why we're here is to really give all of you a real intentional perspective on what the experience has been like for youth organizers on the ground, but just particularly how COVID-19 and everything that has happened in the last few months has really impacted our work, but also how it's impacted us on a personal level. And so with that being said, Tyler, can you just kind of walk people through what the experience has been like doing all this work now since COVID-19 started? How has it shifted sort of the work that you've done at Progeny? And really just talking a little bit about sort of the big picture, right? Like how COVID-19 has impacted the work to close youth prisons in Kansas, but also the fight to really support young people who are currently incarcerated and those in the community in Kansas specifically.
Yeah, so COVID-19 was a big hit for pretty much everyone. We were planning to have a exhibition, a community event to kind of bring some awareness into the juvenile justice system. We were going to have a virtual reality of what it was like in those facilities, having panel speakers, people in the community who have been directly and indirectly impacted. With COVID, that ended up getting shut down. And so a lot of our original planning with canvassing and getting people in the community connected and tied into the work had changed. And also some of the things that really changed for us was the scope of what do we really need to focus on right now. Some of the things that we really had to learn was the shift from doing things from in person to now onto the virtual, which has been a big step for a lot of people, lots of headaches. But getting that work done was pretty good. We started conversations with the key people of KDOC in Kansas, as well as the governor's office, getting in regular communications with them, talking about how COVID affects youth in facilities, what that has already looked like in Kansas prison systems, and what things we want to avoid when it comes to our juveniles, and the precautions that were necessary to make sure that those youth stay safe in that facility. With COVID-19, though, we had a lot of really good work coming out. Our team has been really focused on pushing, getting our information out. We're doing panel discussions, trying to get people in the community enacted while still being safe. And so, yeah, we're doing trainings, events. Like tonight, we have a looking outside the box panel discussion. To just try to bring more information out to the community.
And Tyler, just to ask you a follow-up question, as it relates to, sort of bringing a little bit back to the personal experience, right? What do you think were some of like the immediate challenges that young people in Kansas were particularly facing, particularly those in facilities, right? Because I think, we're out here talking about it from the perspective of being outside and doing all this work to try to help them. But just remembering some of those conditions and how they might have been exacerbated with COVID-19, what are some of the most immediate things that you think were probably like most felt by young people who are currently in facilities in Kansas?
I think the things that a lot of youth had to deal with was just the having to be locked down again, staying enclosed, staying away from, loved ones. One of the big issues that we're discussing whenever we were talking with KDOC is how to make sure that these youth still have communication to the outside world, phone calls that, are able to go on for a little bit longer instead of the limited amount of time with the limited amount of calls you get to make per week. We really wanted to see youth be able to keep in touch with their families, keeping their support system strong while still in facilities. One of the biggest things was we wanted to make sure that mental health was taken care of, because even from my experience of being in the facility, lockdowns and staying in that 8x12 cell does not help. it's a mental drain on anyone who's stayed in there. And I know for me, it caused a lot of depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And so one of the biggest things, we wanted to make sure that these youth weren't just going to be isolated and kept in their rooms 23/1. So we wanted to make sure that, everything is still healthy, everything is still, what we need it to be, while still making sure that youth are healthy in those conditions that they're in right now.
Thank you, Tyler. Iliana, would you be able to also share what the experience was like for you doing the work, especially as it relates to the justice advisors and maybe the shifts that happened right off the bat? I know that we kind of went through a lot with a lot of those shifts, but maybe describing some of those things, and just similar to Tyler, the experiences that you think young people were having in Connecticut behind facilities. And I know one of the questions that somebody already is asking is, what about education? What were some of the things that you were hearing about education in facilities?
Yeah, so I think in terms of like internally, right, with the justice advisors, it was really apparent really quick that it was going to be really tough to just push the work forward. For example, we function best meeting in person, and it brings a different experience. It just gives us life being able to do the work, meeting in person, having in-person interactions. So automatically transitioning to electronic and being just pure virtual, that was really, really hard. We had to make sure that everybody had Wi-Fi. Do people have laptops? Do they have ways to hop on via video, And not only that, but the Zoom fatigue, right? Everybody was really just getting tired of having to be on Zoom 24/7 is what it really feels like. And that it was really challenging. It was challenging to stay productive. It was challenging to keep the work going. It was challenging to meet. Even now, before this event, I literally just left a team meeting and we were talking about how can we make sure that we're meeting everybody's needs? Because I'm the kind of person that I need in person. I need to meet in person. Like I can't function without at least one in-person meeting. And we basically had to negotiate with each other of so what are we willing to do? Is it having meetings outside? What does that look like? So that was super, super challenging for us. And it's still something that we're still dealing with. It's not something that has gotten any easier. We've actually had a lot of people on our team end up having to go and just move on to other work because this wasn't something that they were able to do virtually. And it definitely gives a different sort of engagement, right? You see people in person, you can tell they're engaged, you can physically interact with them. Virtually is a completely different ballgame. So that was really, really tough organization-wise and internally. In terms of young people that are incarcerated or in programs, some of the things that we heard of, and which I feel is very obvious, right? It's got to be you have to feel crazy being in there. You have to feel crazy being in there. You don't get the opportunity to really just protect yourself and take care of your health the way that everybody else does when they're out in the community. So that was one thing that was really a challenge. And then figuring out, right, Connecticut as a state has really gotten to a point where we have a very small percentage of kids incarcerated, being that we recently closed our largest youth prison. There's a small percentage, and we really haven't figured out how to move past that percentage, right? And I don't think there was an urgency to do so during COVID. And we've, as an organization, the Alliance has really pushed to remove as many kids as possible. But it's always been, there's only a little bit of kids there, we don't really have to worry about it. There's only a little bit of kids. And it's okay, if there's only a little bit of kids, then let's find something to do with them, right? Other than having them in prison-like environments. And what does that look like? And then not only that, for everybody, it's pretty much put legislative session on a halt this year, which was really, really tough because we spent a lot of time wrapping up 2019 preparing for session. And working with young people, you have to put a lot of prep into that. And for it to just have been put at a halt and everything was dropped, it was okay, we don't have a work plan for this. We haven't really created a backup work plan if a pandemic takes place. And even now going into 2021 legislative session, it's tough too, because it's we're actively recruiting. We have a new cohort coming in. How do you prepare everybody virtually? And what does that look like? And how do we make sure that we're making it very well known that it is an urgency to still get kids out? Because that conversation has dropped. And it seems like during a time like this, kids aren't the priority. A lot of organizations have prioritized wanting to release more adults and have really much just forgotten about the younger population. So that's been really tough to navigate. It's hard to get young people to advocate during a time like this when they have tons of just real life issues going on at home. People are worried about, a lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of people lost contact with others, a lot of people lost family members. And it's a really tough time to try to work, function, and take care of yourself. There's no way to balance them all. We haven't really mastered it or figured it out. We have tried to put an extra oomph on like self-care, but it's hard to balance the two and still make sure you're keeping the ball rolling and working and doing everything else at the same time. And I could just imagine how much tougher it is for the kids that are actually inside, who again can't even really take the proper safety precautions to take care of themselves, to do anything. I go crazy in my house sitting at this desk for 7 hours. So I could just imagine what it's like being inside of a facility now where solitary confinement is being used even more, right? To keep people safe and to follow the guidelines. So it's a tough time to navigate, and we really haven't figured out how to balance it completely and are still consistently pushing for the state to release young people from prison-like environments.
Thank you, Iliana. One of the things that we did, and it was thanks to your leadership and yours as well, Tyler, was at the very beginning, we tried to organize advocates from around the country, right? Not just those that were connected to Youth First and who had an explicit mission to close youth prisons, but literally 35 plus organizations in 35 plus states. And we all try to come together to create a whole demand to release young people from facilities all over the country and to shift immediately resources into community-based support systems. And we saw a little bit of like an energy and momentum in the beginning, and then eventually everything just died. And that's the literal expression. It was like everyone was kind of working together, and then this hype kind of just got dwindled down. And in part, it had to do a lot with the media. There wasn't a lot of coverage around this issue. There was a lot of coverage on the broader mass incarceration issue and, adult prisons being, one of the hot spots for this, but not really that much on youth prisons. And so, Tyler, could you talk a little bit about maybe what that was like for Kansas specifically, right? Like being able to see just this pivot to us trying to do a lot of digital organizing, and how hard it was maybe to even talk about some of these issues and get attention to them when there was already so much going on around COVID. Was that something that Progeny experienced firsthand? And if so, what did that look like?
So yeah, when it came to a lot of the stuff in Kansas, we were already working with, Kansas is already in a fairly good state right now when it comes to juvenile justice and reform. One of the things that we've, been blessed with, at least for right now, is Senate Bill 367, which was passed back in 2016. That money was originally meant to close down youth facilities in Kansas and reinvest that funds into community-based alternatives. So what we've been really seeing is like this money has been, already been taken. It's been sitting in a pot. It's ready to go, but no one's really been tapping into it. And with that came the closure of one of the second remaining youth facilities that took state-ran or state youth. And then a lot of the halfway houses and a lot of the community support programs for youth coming out of the system also dried up and disappeared. So it was a good and bad thing whenever it came to, taking the money and pulling it to try to re-look at what can be invested. I feel like the execution was a little different. And I know just from being in the system at the time when it happened, I was at Larner Juvenile whenever it was closed down with Senate Bill 367, and I got sent back up to Topeka. And while having these conversations, it's been really difficult with communications because it's always just emails, tag back and forth, especially when trying to talk to legislative people, talking to the heads of KDOC, even trying to get the governor's email to try to talk with her more in depth about what's going on in Kansas and how we can use these reinvestment dollars more effectively in community-based alternatives that our neighboring states are using. And so it's been difficult. It seems like we're trying to dig into a hidden group that is our government. But we're slowly getting, you know, footsteps made and connections made that are, you know, starting to bring our conversations more towards the table. With COVID, things have been really slow, but what some of the things we are currently working on is talking with KDOC, the head staff, into doing a tour of KJCC with our new youth leaders. That way they can get kind of an inside view of, you know, what the facility actually looks like on their day-to-day life. That's kind of how I think of it, as an experience to really open up youth eyes to those who have not experienced what it's like to live in there. As well as looking into other states such as Colorado, Missouri, and Tennessee with different programs like restorative-based practices and how that could look for Kansas, going to more regional-based care and the investment of youth in localized communities.
Thank you, Todd. And I'm going to come back to you for a different question. But Iliana, on the same question, right? I think you mentioned already that the last facility had been closed, and there was just a lot of momentum at some point in Connecticut around some of this. And then there was a lot of media too around, where are young people going to go now that this facility is no longer existent? And then, you know, again, sort of it quieted down. And then once Invest in ECT, which maybe you can talk a little bit more about, came into existence, there's been a lot more momentum again to really highlight the fact that there is a need for us to take that money that was once used to, you know, have this facility and now have it in the community. What has the coverage been like for this conversation, for this issue, for your team, but more importantly, broadly in Connecticut? What has that just felt like, you know, to have media sometimes support some of the stuff that you all are putting out there and sometimes just be very quiet about some of the things that you all have?
So I'll share a little bit with folks about like the Invest in ECT stuff, so you can kind of understand where I'm coming from with my response, right? So part of working as a youth adult partnership is we've taken, since we've had our justice advisors in 2017, we realized we've always had a small cohort, right? We had about 6-7 people on the team. That's not enough experiences to speak to the experiences of the state. So we decided to do these things called vision sessions, where we would essentially go into different programs, facilities, community spaces, and have conversations with directly impacted young people and families, and really just talk through, right, what works in the system, what doesn't work in the system, where are there gaps, you know, what do you lack in your community, what has led you into the system, and what could have prevented you from landing in there. And all these conversations led by credible messengers, which would be our justice advisors, and spent the last 3 years doing that. Coming into 2020, really we're just able to dissect and really seek through those notes and identify, like, what is it that we were hearing? What are people saying? You know, what are the common themes that are coming out of these conversations? And what are some solutions? How do we address them? What are the calls to action that we're able to pull from this to really just address the problem? And through that, we were able to identify 7 themes of systemic issues that need to be addressed, right, for families and young people to thrive. Things like housing insecurity, economic insecurity, need for equal opportunities, abuse of authority, right? Trauma caused within communities, things like that. And then along with those 7 themes, we were able to identify 10 calls to action to address them. And some were vague, some were very specific. For example, I'll share 2. One was like prioritizing getting young people out of prison-like environments and reinvesting those dollars into non-traditional one-size-fit-all solutions. Versus another call to action, which was really like the state needs to create an implementation plan to address the racial and ethnic disparities across the state. So with that, we were like, what's the underlying issue, right? What is the underlying issue of all these things? And it was like, we lack investment, right? We need to invest time, love, care, dollars, energy into families and communities. So along with that, we were able to design our Invest in ECT campaign, which was launched in June of this year. And I will say, throughout the time that we were doing the vision sessions, up until the time that we launched Invest in ECT, we've always have been screaming, we need to reinvest dollars. We need to divest from places such as having SROs in schools or police departments, right? And reinvest those dollars into the communities where they're needed, right? And these are the things that young people are telling us that they need. And I think the media has always played in some way a problem. The media has, in the past, really just obviously presented the racial and ethnic disparity issue. And when I say that, I mean it as in, we've had situations where a young Black male or Hispanic male or female or whomever has engaged in an activity very similar to their white counterpart. And the media portrays it differently, right? When it's the Black or the Spanish kid, it's this juvenile did this, and we should be scared, right? And sometimes the media, or in reality, the media has the power to shake up the city, right? The media builds fear. People rely on the media. Versus when it's the white counterpart, it's young teenager did this, or teenager from this had a distraught experience, which led them to doing this. And that has always played a part in how our cities react and the fear that they put in them. And we've seen that very clearly through COVID, where now the issue isn't, oh, we've never invested in housing, we've never invested in this, we've never paid attention to race or bias or how that's impacted systems and people, right? The issue is, we need to get rid of, this community is a problem, or even something small, right? Like COVID, obviously, everybody has been stuck at home. And a lot of young people in New Haven love to ride their dirt bikes. And the media has portrayed that as the worst thing in the world, right? And it's worked against us, because now we have the governor creating more harsh and criminalized penalties, to address these kinds of things, right? Kids get caught with their dirt bike, $1,000 fine. Second time you get caught, $2,000 fine. Knowing, right, these kids already come from communities of poverty. They don't have the dollars to pay that, and we know that. And it's very different in other communities where kids have trails to ride their bikes or access to large fields to ride their bikes. So just little things like that have been very prevalent as to like how much the media plays a role in how communities react to things. I feel like throughout COVID, the media has put fear in people's hearts, and it impacts our job, right? Because then when we go out and we advocate for kids not needing to be in prison-like environments, people are like, but they need to. Where else would they go? Have you seen this thing in the news? And have you seen what they said here? And it's like, that thing that they posted in the news is something that happens every day in other communities too. They just don't blow it up as easy, or make it as big of a deal. And I think this goes way before COVID, right? The media has always been a big influencer. We live in a life of media, and it's really challenging. And sometimes it's played in our part where we've had, reporters, whomever, really just amplify our asks, our campaign, our work. We have some champion reporters that really just are willing and always on standby to help us put together op-eds or blog posts or whatever it may be. And then we have some that are just like, I'm sorry, and my opinion is completely different. And that really it impacts not only the way that we work and what we're able to advocate for, but it impacts our ability to partner with community. Because when we pitch this idea of no kids in prison and this is why, and we start talking therapy and healing, people are looking at us like, nah, I didn't read none of that in the news. That's not what I heard in the news the other day. Or that doesn't sound like what these kids need, the news said this. So I think just media plays a really, really big part. It's always has and always will impact our work. It's just something that as an organization, we just always have to maneuver around and know how to respond or whatever it might be. I think it's always going to be a challenge, and it calls for bigger conversations, right, about how media is and how they play a role in the community and what that can look like in the future to avoid causing fear in communities, and really just making sure that we're spreading facts, and trying to keep our communities safe. Because I feel like, again, it's a big fear factor for us. So.
Thank you, Iliana. I think what you just ended on is so on point, right? There is this tendency for really bad news to travel quickly versus the good stuff that's happening in our communities, and oftentimes it's because there are multiple outlets sharing the same thing or the same kind of really harmful narrative out there. And so, Tyler, towards the end, and Iliana was also kind of getting into it, there is this piece around restorative, dialogue and narrative, right? And what does it mean to really start shifting away from us talking about incarceration from the perspective of punitiveness and, punishment and those mugshots and like the really negative images, towards this larger vision of a restorative community and community-based supports. And, that might not, land equally with all of the people who are out there who have some influence over the criminal justice system. But what has that experience been like for Kansas, Tyler, talking about restorative justice and restorative conversations? And, You know, there's always that scenario of the young person who maybe killed someone or raped someone, and that's what media immediately jumps to, or worst case scenario, even government immediately jumps to. And, you know, as someone like myself who was incarcerated for attempted murder, I'm always like, man, if media just destroyed me when I was younger, through what I did, then, you know, that probably, I'd still be cleaning that up on Google. Luckily, that wasn't the case. But Tyler, when you're talking about restorative justice in Kansas for young people in Kansas, how have people received that, the conversation around restoration as opposed to punishment?
So when it comes to different discussions, so we've talked to schools, we've had different communications with youth in the community, as long with our visioning sessions, looking into, you know, what do they see that their community needs, and we put that all into a report, looking into, you know, what are some of the key factors and why youth are even, you know, committing crimes. And so we really wanted to look at restorative justice, not only as a proactive way to eliminate the use of youth incarceration, youth facilities such as KJCC, the Kansas Juvenile Correctional Complex. But we want to see more, you know, work in the community. We want to see, whenever we have these conversations, it's always, we want to, you know, see the healing of the victims, as well as the impact on what it's had in the community, as well as bringing the tools that are needed for youth to really help them understand the situation, as well as, you know, what can be learned from it, and as well as giving them a chance to speak from their side. So one of the things that, when it comes to, you know, talking about this and really getting people in tide, we really just, as far as communications go, we feel like the youth in the community, as well as some of the parents of youth who have been directly impacted, as well as people who just have family members who have been impacted by the juvenile justice system, feel as though this could be something very beneficial. During our talks with KDOC, we've had some very positive conversations of, yes, we understand that the Kansas system is outdated, but we don't know how to, you know, look into what does reinvestment look like. Does it look like closing the last youth facility and going towards regional-based models, such as restorative justice and restorative-based programming? But what does that look like for, you know, these facilities? What does it look like to remove the youth facilities? And so the conversations seem open in Kansas. It's just looking at the whole logistics and the fine tuning to make sure that this is something that can 100% fit. So just making sure that the youth have their voices in, making sure that community have their voices in, and then trying to bring those voices and those concerns up to the Bake House.
Got it. Thank you, Tyler. Iliana, can you also just dive a little bit more into that particular piece too, from the Connecticut standpoint? Just like when it comes to the severity of crimes, and I think sometimes what I remember from Connecticut and working with you, that like that bit that's left, that's still being touched by the system, is oftentimes young people who are at the deep end, who've committed some of these more serious crimes, and who are oftentimes, you know, glamorized on the media for some of the stuff that they've done. And so how have you all either countered those conversations and or just really tried to promote something that really does uplift this restorative narrative that oftentimes is not portrayed in the media regularly?
I mean, so aside from how, you know, utilizing our vision sessions to speak directly with those kids, right? Because we've gotten the opportunity to go inside of facilities and talk to that small percentage, right, that commits those more serious crimes. And I recommend to anybody, right, if you wanna find a solution, go to the problem, or go to who has the problem at their hands, right? And those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So I mean, that's always my go-to of, we need to be talking with the kids who are in these predicaments. And we've done that It reflects in our report, it reflects in our campaign, right, in our work. But aside from that, I mean, for example, Connecticut has brought in outside agencies to help them figure out what do we do with this last percentage of kids that are committing the more serious crimes. And for some reason, I mean, people have the biggest fear in their heart of these kids. And I can tell you myself, I've had the opportunity to sit down with these young people and talk to them, and I couldn't even imagine, like, they look like my little brother, my 16-year-old brother. They're tiny and they're sweet most of the time, even if they're taller, right? Like it's a regular kid you're talking to. And when you really get into these conversations, you realize that it's not just the kid being devious. Don't get me wrong. We've had some kids straight up tell us, like, honestly, I did it just being an ass. You know, I was just, I got into this situation. I just did this. I know I shouldn't have done it, but I ended up in that predicament. But then you have other kids who, for example, they consider, you know, the stealing the cars and the getting into the races, that's a more serious crime, right? Sometimes it ends up deadly. And there's some kids who just say, like, yo, it started off as me stealing the car to find somewhere to sleep or to get to work or whatever it is. And it ended up in a situation that I just didn't expect, right? And I think we really need to have conversations about accountability on both ends, the system and where the system has failed, and young people, right? And where they mess up, or families and communities, however we wanna explore that conversation. At the Alliance, we've always relied on what's going on in other states, right? What practices exist in other states that have been working, right? And how do we address these root issues? And we're always constantly, my favorite word is address the root issues, right? Let's get to the bottom of the problem, because this isn't just and I say this everywhere I go, it's not just a juvenile justice issue. This is a cross-system issue, right? Juvenile justice kids that are in the JJ system don't just have JJ issues. They have housing issues, they have child welfare issues, they have economic issues, they have tons of other problems going on outside of JJ. And for some reason, JJ considers to function as its own little silo, as if the kids don't have anything going on outside of that. One of the things that we've had the opportunity to do is work directly with system stakeholders, right? So speaking directly to Department of Corrections and being able to build a relationship with them, being able to build a relationship with judicial, right? And these aren't problems that we're going to solve overnight, but being able to maintain and build those relationships gives us the opportunity to funnel these different conversations, right? All the things we're hearing from these vision sessions, being able to bring those thoughts and those conversations into these meetings, right? With the hope of being able to influence that. Connecticut has, you know, the Juvenile Justice Policy Oversight Committee. It's a state appointed table, right? With representatives all around the table from different parts of the legislature, Department of Corrections. We have advocates. Thankfully, this year we is our first year with a subgroup specifically created for directly impacted families and young people. And we've gotten the opportunity to have young people around the larger JJPOC as well. Being able to take part in those conversations, right? The JJPOC was created to specifically focus on juvenile justice issues. They have tons of subcommittees: diversion, incarceration, SROs, raising the minimum age of arrest, all these different things. And I believe, you know, the strategy that has really we've always utilized is getting these directly impacted people at these tables to be able to sit down with decision makers and actually be a part of making decisions. And the only way that we're going to get to the root of this issue is by working with those who are directly impacted. If you don't do that, you're never going to be able to identify what lacks in what systems, right? Or what's needed to make sure that these kids don't recidivate. And when they leave JJ, they gradually enter criminal justice, right? And they gradually enter the adult system. So that the goal shouldn't be just to get them by while they're in the juvenile justice system. It needs to be making sure they don't recidivate in any system, right? Setting them up for success. And I feel like that's where we really lack. And this language of restorative justice, it seems really scary to some people. They're like, you know, we've took all these chances in the past. We've raised, you know, the jurisdiction that you can charge as an adult. We've done all these crazy things. We shut down our largest youth prison. Like, we're tired of taking risks. And Connecticut, being one of the most progressive states when it comes to JJ, is really at a point now where they feel like they've done enough. And this is the challenge that we reach of, like, now we want to start these conversations about what does it really look like to implement restorative justice, not for the smaller population of kids who are committing less serious crimes, but for the more serious crimes. And honestly, that's where we get at a stump. People are really scared to function with this population as if it's the scariest thing to do in the world. I feel like there's a lack of humanity in these conversations, and it's really, really tough to get by. So we haven't necessarily mastered how we talk about it. And the language, right? We just know that every room that we go into, every conversation that we get into, sometimes we're the only ones that are in there really advocating for young people needing to be at the table. We need to have these young people at the table. And we have tons of partners that work on our steering committee or other legislative champions that also amplify that. But the odds are sometimes against us, and it's just something that we continue to do and have to continue to do to make sure we can address that problem. And I've had the honor of being on multiple national spaces where it's not just a Connecticut issue. This is an issue nationwide. So it's tough.
Thank you, Iliana. You kind of started answering a little bit of one of the questions that was posed by Lauren Potiet. Hopefully I didn't butcher that last name, I'm sorry. She asked, which states do you feel have the most issues with criminal justice reform, particularly as it pertains to youth? So one of the things that I will highlight, because I am at Youth First and doing some of the national work, is that the experiences that Tyler and Iliana are describing, if you all have noticed, are very similar in terms of some of the conversations that are happening around reinvestment, some of the challenges that they're having with convincing specific stakeholders around having some specific kinds of crimes that young people have committed be looked at differently and treated from a community-based model. I think it's a really hard question to answer, and just saying one state has like the broadest issues when it comes to passing criminal justice reform bills or other things like that. I think one of the things that is positive to see about all of these states, including Kansas and Connecticut, is that there is a huge movement happening around the country to now divest from youth prisons and reinvest that money in community alternatives. So Connecticut and Kansas are 2 of 7 states that even us at Youth First are working with. But even outside of the 9 states that we're working with, there are other states that have also jumped on and said, you know what, we're going to start closing prisons, including in California, where they're really trying to push for a community-based model where probation in some way holds a lot of that, will hold a lot of power moving forward, and there will be a huge divestment from the prisons out there. But the question that has come up even in California has been, you know, can we trust probation to do that work in communities, right? And I think it's a similar question for all of our states, really trying to figure out whether or not there is an ability for us to really trust the system with taking some of the things that they've already done while having institutions in place and then having them be trusted again with creating community-based support systems that oftentimes don't include the community in the development of those things. And so, you know, it's a really broad question, and really trying to think about how we say which state has the most challenge and as it relates to criminal justice reform can oftentimes be challenging. And I'm gonna allow Iliana or Tyler if you have any other thoughts to that question.
I would just quickly add, one of the other things that we're really big on making sure that we bring up, right, is discussing how are these kids ending up in here. It's often that, again, going back to, you know, racism being an issue and bias, right? How are these kids even ending up in the juvenile justice system? It's apparent and very obvious that sometimes, right, your white counterpart can do the same thing as a regular person of color and just end up in a different system. So often we have more kids of color being referred to the juvenile justice system, right, compared to other services that are already community-based and in the communities. So just to emphasize, right, we shouldn't be talking about it from a lens of this is a population that commits more serious crimes, right? Because there's white kids who commit the same serious crimes and don't end up in that same system. We need to be having the conversation of how are these kids even ending up in here in the beginning? We really just need to be honest and upfront about the race issue that this nation has. And again, not just the Connecticut issue, the Kansas issue, Cali issue. Everywhere you go, you're going to see that problem.
For sure. Tyler?
Yeah, one of the things that we're definitely always looking into is why are these youth going into the system? You know, what is their story? What is their why? And one of the things that we're always looking into is the school to prison pipeline, the zero tolerance policies with how the schools use school resource officers to remove youth from classes, and how it's just preconditioning them to be ready for this cycle of going in and out of jail. Looking into the foster care loopholes and the cracks that where kids either go missing or just run away. And a lot of these are happening with a lot of youth, and a lot of youth are becoming homeless, drug addicts, and they're just lost in the streets and forgotten. And in Kansas, we're seeing a lot of these youth just slip through the cracks. And so what we're looking at is just where all these youth are coming from, what the main issues are, and where we can stop the problem before it becomes, worse than it already is.
Thank you, Tyler. And I'm going to start opening up the space so that we can start taking some really great questions that are coming in from the audience. I'm going to hand it over to Emily to start reading some of those questions out loud to y'all so that we can all answer them.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Tyler and Iliana for being here today and speaking to us. The first question we're going to dive into is from Julie Martinez, and this can go to any of the panelists. And she wants to know if you guys seen any downside when local communities take over treatment of justice-involved youth after state facilities are closed.
I can start, and then Tyler, if you have anything to add. Specific to, right, Connecticut specific, with the closure of CJTS, when they did close it, what they did was they created smaller facilities, is what it really is. There's just smaller staff secure facilities, and then they created smaller hardware secure sections inside of the detention facilities to house the young people. So I wouldn't necessarily consider that a community-based alternative for the young people that were coming out of CJTS when it closed. I don't think we've had the opportunity to see it fail, right? And again, just reflecting back on the conversations that I've had in the vision sessions, young people are constantly saying, I attend this great, amazing community-based program, and then it gets defunded. And I feel like that's where the failure happens. You have these great people really working on the ground, really doing this the grassroots organizing, the labor, they're putting in the work, right? They're working directly with these kids. And either the programs are closed or they're not considered credible, so they're not funded. But I mean, state agencies have the tendency to automatically fund, right? The most credible organizations or the ones that they're the most familiar with. So I just think from my opinion, and I may be wrong, we haven't been able to see the opportunity for the community to fail because there's no community-based anything that actually lasts long, right? For young people coming out of facilities. So yeah, that's it. Tyler, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so again, within Kansas, we had a lot of the youth facilities closed down with Senate Bill 367. One of the things that we've really seen is a lot of youth activities, as well as the facilities that have disappeared, for the youth coming out of facility. There's not many, activities or things going on in the community that really want to keep youth here. And keep them really want to, stay in the community. A lot of the programs, like there was the Boys Ranch for youth coming out of the juvenile system that really helped with, independent living skills, learning the basic necessities of, how to live outside of jail to, try to break the cycle. All those things are gone. A lot of the community action or like community events like Biddy Ball, a basketball thing that we used to do in the community, those things have disappeared. And youth are just starting to get bored. And a lot of the research that we have seen, a lot of youth who commit crime do it out of boredom.
Thank you, Tyler. I will just quickly add to both of Iliana and Tyler's points that part of the challenge right now in all of this work is that we do, as Iliana said, not have the full community-based model anywhere. I think all of our states are constantly trying to figure out like what is that model. Everybody wants to find the gold standard, the blueprint, and truthfully, that's the problem, y'all. We don't have a model based on community-based support. We have one where we just lock things up that causes problems. That's literally the way that we've done it for so many years. And it's part of the challenge that we're now trying to go up against, because not only are we trying to dismantle systems that have perpetuated that narrative, but we were also trying to go up against media that oftentimes pushes that narrative even further and continues to perpetuate, as Iliana said, that fear over and over and over. And so I will say that that's part of the challenge of us not having, you know, that issue of whether or not community-based models have failed or not done a good job, is because we haven't even started to make that investment. We're actively trying to convey the need for us to do that. And so on that note, Iliana, Harrison Malkin asked the question specifically for you: in what kinds of media, TV, feature articles and magazines, etc., do you most often see dehumanizing language surrounding people of color in cases of youth incarceration?
I mean, I don't know the difference between an article and an op-ed. I'm not all that great. I call everything an op-ed, but I know that I'm on a lot of newsletter, what is it called? Threads, or like I'm on their constant contact list, and we're constantly finding something that just like is dehumanizing. And I won't throw out like specific news outlet names, right? Because we also do have some reporters that we have good relationships with in those spaces. It's just other reporters that will continue to use the language that is just very dehumanizing. I know we've even reached out directly. I mean, when we see it, we call it out. We reach out to those reporters and let them know, like, could you not use this language? Could you use this language? Or we'll send them examples of like the same story in another piece of like, can you just, you know, stick with the flow and use youth instead of juvenile, or not, refer to this town in this sort of way. And I think what's also like, and it just sometimes honestly just hurts my heart, right, to look at the comments. I've learned something over the last couple of months, and it's, Iliana, do not read the comments, because the amount of racist people that are in the comments, it just blows my mind. The things that they say, they call them gangsters and drug dealers, and they'll say, you know, we don't expect anything less from that torn up, nasty town. It's nothing but ghettos. And it's just like, I can't even believe that 5 years ago, I was oblivious to these kind of people. Like, and I can't even believe that these kinds of people even exist. And you'll even see it. I mean, oh, God forgive me, South Park is hilarious. But that recent South Park pandemic premiere, right? You want to talk about, you know, media as far as TV, even something like that, like, for anybody who has watched it, the example, the school situation, the two white kids were fighting, the cops shot and killed the only black kid in the room. That is real life stuff, like real life stuff. And just stuff like that. Like when kids see that, what do they expect to think? I have a 7-year-old brother who came home the other day and was telling us, Mom, I want to be lighter. Like, come on, he's not any much darker than me, but both of my brothers are black. And he's constantly telling her, like, I just want to be whiter. I want to be whiter. And he goes to a predominantly people of color school. You know, he lives in one of the worst neighborhoods in Connecticut. And for 7-year-olds to be saying that, it's just like what he sees on the media it's impacting his life, him being 7. So imagine older people, especially people who live on their phones. I mean, it's tough. I think it's everywhere. It's in news articles. It's in the media that we watch. It's in TV that we watch. It's everywhere. It's like really, that's a pandemic. And it's just, yeah, sometimes it's really depressing. I mean, I just did a panel yesterday talking about race, and the panel lasted about 2 hours. And one of the girls that I supervised literally texted me and was like, I have to just turn my camera off and cry, because it's like, even having to constantly repeat ourselves of like, this is dehumanizing and this is racist. Like the fact that other people don't get it, it gets draining. And as a person who has been directly impacted, to consistently have to relive that and re-explain that to people, it becomes like, it takes a toll on your mental, you know? And the media, again, just plays a really, really big role in that, especially for those who live on social media. So yeah, I think it's everywhere.
Awesome. Tyler, do you have anything you would like to add to that? You don't have to. No? Okay. Emily, can we get the next question?
Yeah, so we can move on to another question. This one is from Isaac Scherer. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. What sorts of broader trends have you noticed about how the press covers grassroots advocacy and agitation, especially in comparison? And then he said, for example, to the media treatment that politicians and experts get. So like when you're watching news or reading a news article, and the special attention that is given to politicians or quote unquote experts and the voices that they have versus others?
I can add to that, and then Tyler, Hernán, feel free to add. I mean, media follows around politicians. They follow them everywhere they go. Every event that I've been at where a legislator has been there or a decision maker, I mean, media is right behind them, compared to, again, right, the grandma on the block that serves the kids food every day and buys everybody winter jackets. You won't see media covering things like that. And sometimes it questions of like, is media scared to go into the neighborhood, or like, do they only come when they see politicians? We had a big situation in New Haven, Connecticut, where they took down the Columbus statue, and media covered that, but played a very nonpartisan role of like, wouldn't address the fact that the arguments and the things that were happening there were just pure racist. But they were like, oh, young kids from the hill down the street, and long life living Italians that rent the houses on the block are going back and forth over the statue. And it was just little stuff like that, right? So I just feel like they prioritize being in the spaces where politicians are, but when it comes down to actual like community-based people or real advocates, right, that are in the street doing the work, they don't necessarily cover that. I feel like the only time that I've ever heard of like them covering a situation that was led by a young person or designed by a young person is if a politician was there supporting it. And that's unfortunate, because there's a lot of people who do a lot of great individual work in the communities who don't necessarily get the credit. So yeah, I think it's just really relevant how they follow politicians, but they don't necessarily follow the people in the community as much.
And for us in Kansas, it's kind of the same. It's, you know, they always follow the big people that, go around on the news, the same old talking heads. But when it comes to, trying to get, involvement from the media for us, whenever we're doing an event or, trying to get, a message spread out to the community, it's always a constant battle. It seems like, sometimes it's either, we send out a message a week in advance, and then the same day that we're about to do it, they're either like, yes, we can do it, or just don't show up at all. And it's give and take. I mean, we're starting to see more steadily, youth or the media is really starting to follow like our pages on our Instagram and Facebook, or not Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. So we're seeing some media, attention, but it still seems a little bit slow. And even at times where we have to intentionally reach out multiple times to make sure that we can get something done.
I would just add to that too. Sometimes we have to rely on our media champions. I don't know if that's what we would call them, but we have to rely on the people that we have relationships with to get a story out. And I think that's also very different from politicians, where they know somebody's going to cover the story. They don't even have to reach out to get a story covered. So that's really tough too.
Mm.
Thank you, both of you, for answering that. This next question is from Claire Goforth. She's asking, how have young people that you both have worked with been affected by the civil rights protest against systematic racism and police brutality over the summer? How do you think the media can improve on how we report on these perspectives?
I can start again. I feel bad. I don't do good with awkward silence, so I feel like taking the initiative to just be the one to spark the conversation. I think it's impacted young people and communities a lot. We're in a space now where we have to explain and fight for Black Lives Matter. And this, to even be in a space where we have to defend Black Lives Matter being something completely different than things like Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. People have taken that completely out of context and think that it just means only Black Lives Matter. Like, that's not what it is. Just Black lives have never mattered as much as whites. and we need to make sure we're prioritizing Black lives, and we have Black people dying and Spanish people dying, and it's not, we shouldn't have to, I don't know what the best word is, but we shouldn't have to like defend or explain why Black Lives Matter is so important. And I think that people don't recognize the mental toll that is taking on the organizations that have been leading all these protests and really just doing all this work. It's super, super draining. And I think the media should really be covering, one, how draining that is for people and how this shouldn't even be a debate, right? I haven't seen anything local, at least, that really highlights just the stupidity around even comparing blue lives to Black lives. Like, you can take off your uniform and go home at the end of the day. We can't take off our skin color, right? And that's not how that works. People can't just go home and change their color and be safe in a community. And I really think the media needs to emphasize the fact that this is not okay. It's not often that you see a local piece highlighting that this is not okay. Like, and I'm not too familiar with how it goes being a reporter and how you get things published and who you have to report to or get approval from. But like, just, we shouldn't live in a space where we have to explain to our 15, 16-year-old kids, like, your color of the skin, the color of your skin will get you killed, no matter what you do. You can do the same thing as your white friend and your color will get you killed. Like, we need to be having conversations about race publicly. We need to be addressing it publicly, and we need to be just very upfront about the issue. And I feel like sometimes media is scared to do that. And again, they play a very just bipartisan role where they don't want to be they don't want to pick a side sometimes. And that is just as oppressing as it is being the oppressor, like, at this point. And I think that people don't realize that. So I would just say the media really needs to just do a better job at covering the fact that a lot of these arguments are just completely ridiculous and taken out of context, and that we need to be prioritizing the lives of people of color. And I don't think I've seen a lot of pieces on that. And if it is somebody posting a piece, again, it's a champion, right? A champion reporter that we have to reach out to, or an organization that is specifically focused on topics like this. So yeah, and that very tolling on communities.
In Kansas, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, there's a lot of conversations that are happening out in the community. I'm not necessarily seeing them. I have not been a part of them, but I do know that they are going on because I see a lot of our, community leaders, activists, people who are always in the community talking about these conversations, really pushing out the talks, and media just doesn't really cover it. They're already busy taking care of X, Y, and Z. And so most of this is just from ear to mouth, people, telling everyone else about it, just sharing it on social media. That's pretty much the only way that we see a lot of the conversations happen. So yeah.
Thank you, guys. I think you both sort of answered the next question that I was going to ask from Jeremiah, which is that, do you think that critiques of the juvenile justice system that are focused on white youth would find a more receptive audience as opposed to racial disparities? And I think you both kind of already touched on that a little bit, but is there any other thought that you would want to share as it relates to that question? And if not, the next question by also Jeremiah is, and I think this is one that I will also pitch in at the end. It's a really important one. How much should a reporter give credence to a youth's views regarding the factors that led to their criminality when, based on my personal experience as a justice-involved youth, I lack the understanding necessary to identify those factors appropriately? So how much credibility should a reporter give to a young person who is expressing their views around some of the experiences that they've had, knowing that they might lack some of the understanding of some of the things that led to their criminality in the first place? So I think this is a really important question for us all, even for myself at Youth First, because it's really asking, right? When we're doing these visioning sessions and talking to young people who maybe just got out of the justice system, these are some of the young people that we're saying reporters should listen to. Why should we why should we say that these young people should have a lot of credibility when it comes to the way that they talk about the system?
So when it comes to, really bringing in the youth into the talks and, the credibility, using a lot of the youth that we do the work with, it's either you have direct impact, you were directly impacted by the system, you were there firsthand experience. Indirectly impacted, meaning, your family member, loved one, brother, sister, mother, father, whoever is in jail, or, someone who is very close to you that has had a very mental or physical impact on you. As well as people who are, just really interested in the work. I'm sorry, what was the question again? I'm sorry, I had a brain fart.
Now, the question was very much around why we should be giving, why, if at all, should reporters give young people who've been just as involved, why should they consider them as credible sources for some of the things that they say or critiques about the system, when oftentimes they might not lack the full awareness of how the system operates?
We all have our own, shared experiences. Again, breaking those down, everyone has their own experience, from either being the person in the cell to being the loved one, seeing the person in the cell. It all has a great impact, and especially in youth development, the nuclear family, there's a lot of different key points that you can see that, just by not having that person there or being that person in the cell, all the opportunities lost, all the things that are lost, and to give a vantage and a perspective point, from being that person in the system or being that child with the father who's in jail, it opens up, different viewpoints of, okay, yes, this is something that is working, but is it really working? And let's talk to the people who are actually there, who have been through those walks, to see, is it working? And if not, what they can do to try to mitigate that and make it better. So bringing the directly and indirectly impacted is key to everything. You can't just have a conversation about people and not include the people.
Yeah, and I would build on that and just say, right, like, why not? They're the people they're basically, half the time lab rats. When people are experimenting with new models or whatever, right? The people that are being directly impacted are the ones who are going to be able that's how they measure the success. Did this work or did this not work, right? I think if you want to have a conversation with a young person about what led you into the system, right? Something more deeper, tapping into their experiences and unpacking their trauma and what has led them up to that experience. I would always recommend, going to a group like ours, right? Progeny, the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. There's tons of different youth-led organizations or youth adult partnership models that have put hours and time and months and years into helping people unpack that and helping them recognize, well, what has led you on the path that you've lived, right? And what factors played part in that. So if you feel as if a person coming fresh out of the system isn't a reliable source, right, then go find a group that has been really working with young people to unpack that and really just identify what problems that they've dealt with. I think also too, right, we trust people with college educations to create models to deal with young people who experience things that these people probably have never experienced in their life. So I would question, how do you trust somebody who hasn't lived that experience to create a solution for that experience? So I think it could go both ways.
Yeah, I'll finish off with why I said this was an important question. When I first came out of prison 8 years ago, I was one of the few young people who would actively be put on every single panel where there were system leaders in the audience. And part of what I used to do a lot of when I first got out was give praises to all of the good things that I went through while in prison, including the college program that inevitably turned my life around. And then as I delved deeper and deeper into my education and into this work, I began to see that I was actively condoning harm on me as a young person, that I was actively saying that what I went through, all the violence that I experienced, all the oppressive and very negative language that I had to endure while incarcerated was okay because look at me now. And so I think the opposite can be said about, when young people are out and they do obtain that level of awareness, that you come to realize that, like, yeah, my experience was hella fucked up. It wasn't that I was trying to mask what was going on, but at the time I was also at an organization where I was doing a lot of work with system leaders. And so part of what I felt was that I owed it to my job, which was paying my bills, and also the work that I was doing, to say that here are some good things that we can still do to a system that nearly made me take my own life literally 2 years ago, back in 2018. And so I hate to say that, reporters shouldn't look at young people as credible sources because they might not, be able to fully articulate their experience. But truth be said, whenever we talk to young people, whether it's in Connecticut, in Kansas, in New York, around the country, we hear the same narratives of how much they went through in prison and oftentimes how long it takes for them to recover from those experiences. And so even for us who are doing this work, like myself, Tyler, and Iliana, we're still actively sort of working through some of the trauma we experienced through the system. And so to say that, we would put in question the credibility of young people in any way just because they can't fully share in, very specific terminology or articulate ways the things that the system had an impact on them with, I think is missing the point that, the same can be said for if you have a young person on the opposite end who's already gone through all of this. There is a huge narrative too in the healing justice space where some folks who've gone through the justice system have not had the opportunity to process some of the stuff that they went through as a result of the work that we've been doing to reform these systems, but also because we just are so stuck in the work that we kind of just keep plowing ahead and never really hear from our own traumas. And so, I think that there's room to create a space where we all collectively heal and where we all have these conversations around why it's important to listen to Tyler, to Iliana, to a younger version of me, still maybe me now, because if you would have heard me 8 years ago when I first came out of the system, I still sounded the same, but I sounded very, fix the system, we got this, we can change a policy and it'll get better. And now you're hearing me say, we need to close them down because these places are not meant for young people. So, there's a lot of room there for us to think about what supports young people need. And the media can really play a role in just making sure that young people's voices are heard across the board because it's really important to have them heard. Thank you, Jeremiah, for that question.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Hernán, for sharing. So we're going to move on to another question. This one's from Charlotte West. And she brought up that earlier we talked a little bit about Grace. It was a story of a young girl who was incarcerated because of missing online school. Are you guys seeing youth who are on probation being held to a higher standard than their peers? And then she cited saying several estimates have shown that 20% of more of all students aren't showing up for school at all. And that those who are on probation are being held to this higher standard, even though their peers aren't being held to that. And she asked, how pervasive is this issue? And anyone who feels strongly can start.
I personally can't speak to that because I don't have any direct contact with anybody who's actively on probation and in school. So I will pass it on to Hernán or Tyler.
I'm in the same boat. I honestly don't know anyone who's still actively on probation or in school.
Yeah, I've only heard anecdotes from different state partners around some of this. It is, I think, an issue that is now increasingly becoming more visible because we're this far into COVID-19 and some of the changes that were actively implemented at the beginning of COVID-19, which included placing more young people on probation and not in facilities, have taken root. And so I think this is an issue that will likely become more and more visible as time goes on, as COVID continues, and as we continue to have young people who are, again, not being sent into facilities, not necessarily because people don't want to, but because they'd rather not have a fatality in a facility as opposed to a young person outside, you know, struggling and going through all of these challenges. And so I think we're going to see more of that, and we'll likely have more conversations around this in the future. The next question here is from Cybele Osterman, Mays Osterman. What role can reporters play in holding accountable the system that perpetuates the school to prison pipeline and amplifying youth voices? Iliana, Tyler?
I would personally say covering more stories that come directly from the people that are working on this issue. One of the ways that you can contribute to that is by speaking to the issue of SROs, which I know somebody else asked a question about that, so I won't dig too deep into it until we get to that question. But, you know, start covering stories on ways to get these criminalizing factors out of schools, right? Start covering stories about, you know, how a lot of schools in inner cities are underfunded. Start pointing out those things, because I feel like, I mean, and I can only speak for Connecticut, but like we have Bridgeport schools that go without paper at the end of the year. We have students still without laptops. We have students that are still handing in packages of work, compared to the predominantly white cities that have had laptops since early this year, March. Start covering those kinds of things to hold these systems accountable for that. You know, start being very open about what education providers are working and what education providers are not working. Because for a long time, Connecticut has mainly, I mean, especially in the system, contracted the same provider for education for a very long time that a lot of people know doesn't work. But I feel like they settle for it because it's considered credible and it's been around for so long. So just start covering stories on those issues and being a part of those conversations, again, with the people who are directly working on these problems.
Yeah, kind of like what Iliana said. Definitely that, and just keep in loop with the organizations who are doing the work. You know, a lot of the stuff that we do with Progeny, when we're looking into panel discussions with school resource officers, you know, the superintendent of facilities, as well as, you know, a lot of our conversations and talks, we always put them out on our social media to save the date, you know, get information. So I would just encourage people to follow our social media. Just look it up, check it out, follow us. And that's, if you want information about what's going on, and especially with the organizations and what we're doing, you got to come to us too.
Thank you, Taylor.
Speaking more, going into the next question about, you know, coming to you and what things journalists can do better. What do you guys think that journalists don't ask enough of, specifically to officials within the juvenile justice system? So what questions do you think they could be asking to leaders and officials that would better cover stories about juvenile justice?
So like some of the things that we've been really looking into is like updates on the youth, what policies are being enacted, what are like some of the information that we never knew even went out to the public is like when we were talking with KDOC about how is COVID going to affect KJCC, we really wanted to end youth intakes. And that was something that, you know, we didn't really hear. It was mainly kept hush hush. You know, we got the information from them, but it never really seemed to get out. So like updates on information, what is going on, you know, youth in the facility or people in the facility, like the rates of, you know, with the COVID scenario, like infection, what is being enacted, policies, just making sure that the status of the facility and that of these people are still being taken care of and remembered. Y'all can probably talk a little bit more about that than I can.
I would just build on that and say really digging deep into the story. Like, for example, you'll see a lot of pieces coming out about like Incarceration rates are dropping and more people are being released and et cetera, et cetera. But if you dig deeper into that story, right, and I always go back to this issue of race, you see that those rates are dropping for predominantly white bodies than bodies of color. So it's sometimes them not digging completely into the story and needing to just actively be talking about the racial and ethnic disparities issue. And I feel like that's a big driver of all the systems that not enough conversations are taking place about. And I'm not sure if it's because people are uncomfortable talking about it, you haven't unpacked your own privilege or racism or whatever it may be. We need to be having conversations about that, regardless of what system we're talking about. And we need to be making those conversations the forefront of the issue. So I think just digging deeper into those, and again, don't stick to just who you know is always in the articles, right? Do your homework, dig deep into who's really doing the on the ground work, really get involved in the community and just outsourcing, right? Looking at other sources and figuring out who else can you loop into the conversation, getting multiple perspectives. I think things like that are really important.
Awesome. Thank you, Iliana and Tyler. In the spirit of time, we have 15 minutes and we have some bomb-ass questions that I'm reading towards. So we're going to try to bang them out as effectively as possible, y'all. So be sure to be like on point. The next question is, what are the best practices for gaining trust with advocates, youth, family members, and community members to gain story ideas, information, and interviews? What are some of the best practices around some of that?
Don't be transactional. Be very intentional about wanting to build a relationship. Don't just visit for your story only, right? Look into whether it's you seeing other stories and being able to funnel them back and forth. Just being very intentional about that relationship and wanting to maintain it. And working closely with those people. I think that it's not going to be something you can just dive into and they're automatically going to trust you. You have to show consistency, and sometimes consistency looks different in different spaces, but just being very consistent. Again, intentionality and consistency.
And I agree with that. Definitely building a relationship. When it comes to a lot of the youth who do the work that we do, we can see right through the BS. So, keeping up front, being real, as well as being able to understand that, not every youth is going to be comfortable telling their full story, giving their full details, sharing all their personal info and, their history. Be accepting of that, just don't push too hard. You don't want to reopen wounds, but you definitely want to still give, their power to their story. So.
Yes, and avoid exploitation. Try not to exploit people, which goes back to the intentionality thing.
Yeah, for sure. I would just quickly add too, be real, be a person. I think y'all have noticed, I just talk how I talk no matter where I'm at, whether it's reporters, whether it's elected officials, whether it's young people and families and community members respect that, see that. If you're over here trying to just act the hella profesh just because you come off profesh, that sometimes doesn't land well. So honestly, just also be yourself, be human, because these are other people who you're working with and trying to get a story from. So they want to know that you're someone that they can talk to on a real level. The next question is from Levi Pulkinen. I'm sorry if I'm butchering the last name. Thinking about the reforms in Kansas and Connecticut or elsewhere, where are the pinch points in making them real? How do they get watered down after they're enacted? More to the point, what should we journalists be looking for after the elected officials declare victory? I think this is both of you can answer this beautifully.
So yeah, when it comes to our conversations, definitely just maintaining connection on what's happening. So we've done a lot of work in our community. We've done a lot of connections, and we've done so much great work. And then as soon as it gets to the big people, the legislature, the decision makers, once we deliver it, it just seems to drop. So just following up, checking in online, checking in with the organizations on what's happening, if they've received any updates, as well as talking to those key officials who were included in the conversation, just to make sure that things are still happening and that they're following through with their promises.
I would say too, following up on implementation. Don't just cover the story while it's nice and active and before, you know, the bill is passed or whatever it may be. Follow up afterwards and see, is the state actually implementing this? Is it something that they stuck to? How does that work? I know, for example, you know, with the police accountability bills, ACLU has done a great job of literally breaking it down in regular people language for communities to actually be able to understand. I think that's another big thing in media. Sometimes there's great stuff being covered that's really, really important for the community to know, but they don't understand it because you use a lot of like language that they're not familiar with, or like, you know, all this legislation language is just confusing overall and takes a long time to understand. So maybe just being more conscious of, you know, your target audience. And if you want to be able to break down something in a bill or whatever to communities, you need to be able to use community language. So just being able to be like a translator. So that would be something that I would suggest too.
Thank you, Iliana.
So moving into the next question, we touched on this a little bit before, but if the panelists would like to share a little bit from their perspective about the role of SROs in the school to prison pipeline. Brandon said in his question that in his coverage, there's obviously a heated debate about the issues. So if you guys wanted to speak about your opinion on whether to keep them or not.
I personally think that SROs don't belong in schools. I don't say that because I've had a negative experience. I've had a little bit of both. Growing up in high school, I've loved some of my SROs and I couldn't stand some of them. Some of them are really aggressive. Some of them just seem like they were there for no reason. I don't think it's a debate of whether they're good or bad. I think it's just the fact that that's not their job. They're there doing the job of like a guidance counselor or a credible messenger that could be, you know, hired into the schools to de-escalate issues. Usually when people see cops, that's it. That's escalation right there. They shouldn't be there to de-escalate anything because, I mean, the cops is the last resort. So to have them there as the first one, it's really just counterproductive and sometimes really intimidating. And kids react different when they see a cop versus a credible messenger coming to talk to them or a guidance counselor whom they're able to build a relationship with. So again, I don't think it's a debate whether they're good or bad. I think it's just, that's not their place of employment. They shouldn't be inside of school facilities. And if you look across the map, you'll see what schools they land in, and it's not all of them.
And when it comes to SROs in schools, I mean, I see their place, but I don't feel that they should have any, you know, say or do when it comes to punishment to youth during those schools. Because again, that's something that can be handled in the school. I don't feel, you know, preparing youth to become normalized when, you know, police come to arrest you and have that trauma of, you know, being arrested in school and having your peers see you through all that. It's very unbeneficial, and the use of the SROs as, you know, their tool for punishment shouldn't definitely not be, you know, thought of in the first place. I feel that the punishment and things need to stay within the school and within reason, and that the SROs have their own place, and that's to protect the school, not to be the punishers for the school.
Powerful. Thank you, Tyler. The next question is a really important one again. In your work, is there adequate access to mental health care for youth involved in the justice system, either while in or after they get out?
I personally don't think so. I think there's a lot of models that were like created to kind of reflect some sort of mental health assistance. I don't know, DBT, DTV, I don't know what the acronyms are, but a lot of kids usually push back on that for several reasons, whether it's facilitated by somebody who can't relate to them, doesn't look like them, they don't feel comfortable talking to, or they just don't understand the process, or the environment that they're in is not made for that process. I think that what the things that are in place are not working, and for some reason we rely on, you know, what's best practice, but best practice is usually an all size fits one. And that's exactly why it's not best practice. So I'm not really sure why we usually rely on that. But yeah, I don't think so. I think that there's some resources out there and they'll tell you call 211 or you can go to Clifford Beers or all these other places, but like they look intimidating. Like hotlines and stuff like that are not usually useful. We need people that are going to meet these kids where they're at, that are going to be consistent with them. It's very hard to build a relationship with a young person, especially a young person that has been through a lot of things. So I think relying on them to go looking for the resource or giving them a mandatory resource is never good.
And I definitely agree, and especially whenever I was in facility, mental health was kind of the byproduct of, you know, incarceration for youth. You know, it was there, you know, but most of it was just medication. You know, oh, you're feeling sad, here's some antidepressants. Oh, you're bouncing off the walls, you're going crazy, staff can't handle you, here's some ADHD meds. And, you know, talks once a month, that's not beneficial. You know, youth actually need someone who are there in their lives that they could just talk to decompress, to release the BS, and just to be there. And so it's, when it comes to healing, it's not, like Iliana said, it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. I'm just going to close off with this thought and around this particular piece. I mentioned earlier that 2 years ago, I attempted suicide. I'm very blunt about that now. I never spoke about it 2 years ago. I didn't even speak about it up until a year ago after I started going to therapy. Therapy wasn't even a thing while I was incarcerated. Sure, I spoke to a counselor a couple of times, and the couple of times that I did, I would come right back out to the unit and a fight could break out, or I get a bad phone call, and all of that work that I just did in maybe 30 minutes of meeting with a counselor went out the window. There aren't that many mental health supports inside of facilities and even outside. And I know Iliana and Tyler can attest to this. You know, we as advocates, organizers do not have enough supports either, even for ourselves. So we know that there is lack of access to mental health care resources for us as advocates and organizers, and we can only imagine how our communities are also suffering. And right now under COVID-19, suicide rates have gone up. The issues around depression and anxiety disorders have also gone up. And so it's a very important issue that we should start looking at together, not only in the criminal justice side, but as a public health issue, a public health crisis that mass incarceration is also contributing to, because we do have family members whose mental health is going down the window because they are so afraid that their loved one right now sitting in a facility somewhere in this country might die. And so just keeping that in mind as a very important issue to cover, and just a broader conversation around healing really ties into restorative narrative, and also just seeing a world where prisons no longer exist, and where we actively support communities at, you know, in their where we actively support families in their communities and without the need for prisons everywhere. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'd like to invite Stephen now to close this out.
Thank you, Hernán. And special thanks to Iliana and Tyler for their really candid and compelling participation. I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did too. We are just about at the end of the time for this afternoon. And I obviously a big shout out to Hernán for his frankness and for bringing all the conversation together and all the questions we've got. I think we've answered most of them. But once again, if any of you have additional questions you want to pose to the speakers, please send me an email and we will pose them just as we're doing to Nate Bayless, and try to answer them on our conference page. Please use the conference page as kind of your main conduit, your main channel for information regarding all the webinar series. We'll keep posting new stuff on it. We'll tell you about any changes in the agenda, the new bios, stuff like that. So bookmark it and come back to it as often as you can. We'll start again tomorrow at 1 o'clock sharp, as we did today. And again, I want to thank all of you for joining us, for being such a great audience, and for asking such great questions. So we'll see you tomorrow. Stay well and stay safe.